Hello everybody, and welcome once again to the C-Bus Paranormal Paracast. I'm your host, Johnathon Robson, and on today's episode we'll be continuing our discussion on Prospect Place Mansion in Trinway, Ohio. We are currently progressing through the different eras of the mansion's history, and if you haven't listened to part 1 of this episode, I strongly encourage you to do so, as I'll be starting today's episode from where we left off on part 1. I do think it's important to note that all of the information that we've previously went over, and will be going over, is still currently being researched as new information becomes available. Even in between episodes, I've received some new information on George Blackburn through journal entries of a previous resident in Adams Mills, Ohio. So while we now know more about the mansion than we ever have in the past, there always seems to be new and updated information that eventually presents itself. It's pretty fascinating to see the complete story of the mansion's beginnings now coming back to life. That being said, we still have a lot of information to cover, so let's get back to it. For our new listeners, please remember to follow us on social media, visit cbusparanormal.com, and subscribe to the C-Bus Paranormal Paracast for the latest updates. We also have a Patreon page set up for additional content. We offer ad-free episodes, behind-the-scenes looks into our investigations, exclusive content, and we'll give shout-outs to new subscribers on future episodes of the Paracast. We're looking to expand the Patreon page as we go, and we're looking to make it even more interactive in the near future. A small monthly donation goes a long way in helping us provide new content for the show. For more information, visit patreon.com/cbusparanormal paracast. We ended the first part of this episode with the death and burial of George W. Adams, along with his body being exhumed, and a second burial. Yeah, it was a complicated situation. George's widow, Mary Adams, would eventually move to Zanesville after his death, and one of George's sons, John J. Adams, would go on to become a lawyer, and then be elected as a judge for the Fifth Circuit Court of Ohio. He would be the first Republican judge elected to this bench, and he would serve 6 terms in this position from 1895 to 1901. During this time, Prospect Place Mansion would also go through a series of changes and be passed down to George Adams' daughter, Anna Adams. Anna Adams' tenure with the mansion would also bring its own share of challenges and mysteries. Anna married one of the local wealthy gentlemen of the community named William Cox. William was later known for being a heavy spender. It's believed that he burnt through most of his own inheritance and did a number to Anna's inheritance as well in a rather short amount of time. The couple were known for their over-the-top lavish parties at the mansion, and a few house guests even provided their own fond memories of these parties to the local papers a few decades later. Signs of money trouble actually started to come to a head in early 1895. Through my research, I was able to find quite a few warning signs of this. William had been contemplating a trip out west, and he gave his stepson, A.A. Greiner, $1,000 in cash to keep for him until his return. Greiner was to run the family store in his absence. Apparently, William came back to claim the money, but Greiner claimed to have used the money to square up the store's debts that they'd obtained since William had been gone. William would then eventually take Greiner to court over the incident. William's debts would continue to pile up, and a sale had been advertised to sell off some of his personal property and assets. He would leave Prospect Place on November 15, 1895, and he would never return to Prospect Place again. William would be seen in Columbus shortly after his disappearance with an unknown gentleman, but disappeared shortly after. A detective was assigned to his case, but William was never heard from officially again. Some of his land and assets were later sold in court in the months after his disappearance to pay for his debts, but Anna was left to fend for herself and the family. Shortly after his disappearance, William and Anna's stepdaughter Constance would also die in Prospect Place at the age of 21 from tuberculosis. The following information is from the local newspaper archives. Is William Cox dead? That is the question agitating the public today, or if not dead, what has become of him? The mysterious disappearance of Mr. William E. Cox, whose country residence, Prospect Place, located between Dresden and Trinway, is the most palatial in the county, has been the theme of conversation in the community for the past week. While it was known last week that he had disappeared, and no trace of him could be found, although a detective had been put on his trail, yet it was hoped and thought he would turn up, and through respect for the feelings of his family and connections, this paper refrained from mentioning the matter in any respect. But Mr. Cox is gone completely, as if the very earth had opened up and swallowed him in spite of every effort made to get some trace of him by his family, his legal advisors, and his friends. None can be had. I was able to find a new newspaper article during my research, and it stated that William Cox had been seen in Denver, Colorado, presumably traveling west. Anna would later receive a letter from a family member shortly after in California that had claimed to see William on the streets of San Francisco. The relative was positive that it was William, and they wanted to notify Anna as William never contacted her after his disappearance. The following article is from the Times Recorder on December 30th, 1895. W.E. Cox located, seen on the streets of San Francisco by Miss Jenny Adams, who formerly resided there. Miss W.E. Cox has received a letter from Jenny Adams, daughter of the late Samuel Adams, and who was born and for the greater part of her life resided in Dresden, in which she states that she met Mr. Cox a few days ago upon the streets of San Francisco, California, in company of a strange gentleman. Having been absent from Dresden for several years and having been intimately acquainted with Mr. Cox, she was naturally very pleased at seeing him, and advanced toward him calling his name and asking a question about his folks, etc. Almost in the same breath he seemed annoyed, did not speak a word to her, and hastily swept past her. She started after him, and seeing her following, he entered a cigar store. She, thinking perhaps that he did not recognize her, followed him in, but he passed on into a sideway and hid from her. She had no knowledge of his disappearance here, and being an old friend of his wife's, wrote to Miss Cox telling about Will's strange actions. It was undoubtedly Mr. Cox, as it seemed impossible that she could be mistaken, and then his actions almost verify his identity. A peculiar and interesting matter is developed in connection with the disappearance of Mr. Cox. On November 8th he was a guest at Schrader's Hotel in Columbus, and he had with him a friend who he refused to register, and he and the clerk had a few warm words over the affair. A good description has been obtained of this man from Schrader's clerk, and a peculiar and perhaps significant part of it comes from when the strange man who was seen with Mr. Cox in San Francisco by Miss Adams tallies to a dot with the description of a person furnished by Schrader's clerk. Miss Cox feels perfectly satisfied that Miss Adams could make no mistake and that the man that she saw in California is none other than her husband, W.E. Cox. Why he is there, no one but himself knows at present, but perhaps later developments may sometime reveal his object for his, to say the least, strange and unnatural actions. William is believed to have died in a great earthquake of 1905 in San Francisco. However, further research should be conducted on that claim. The statement itself was made by the previous administration and prior caretaker Jeff Adams. I personally haven't seen any valid documentation to support this theory at this time. I also asked him at one point if Anna had died in the house or at the hospital. At that time he believed it was at the house. However, her death certificate states that she died in Bethesda Hospital in 1924. Prospect Place would then be inherited by Anna and William's son, George Cox. I was able to find several furniture sale advertisements in a local paper shortly after her death. It appears that George sold off her assets, and would rent the mansion out to a series of renters over several decades. Unfortunately, there isn't much information on the mansion from this time period, but it does seem that the mansion was still being used for special events and family reunions. It doesn't appear that George Cox ever lived in the home while he owned it. The mansion would go through a series of renters and caretakers until it was sold to the Cox Gravel Company in 1969. The company would open the home for tours in 1976 during the American Bicentennial, but closed the mansion shortly after due to a lack of maintenance. A leaking roof would cause floors to collapse, and vandals would start coming onto the property and cause massive amounts of damage through the 1980s. Sadly, the mansion's marble mantels were destroyed, along with its long winding staircase banister. The house would eventually be scheduled for demolition in 1988. However, local business owner and basket tycoon Dave Longenberger would come in and save it before the demolition could begin. Dave wanted to turn the mansion into an office space, and I've actually seen his blueprints. They were honestly rather interesting. Dave had plans to put a pond out in the front yard, which seems odd, but it also shows he had great plans for the property. Unfortunately, his ideas never came to fruition, but he was able to fix the cupola from sinking into the ballroom, install a new roof, and fix some of the existing floor damage. Dave would unfortunately pass before his vision of restoring the property could be realized. Eventually, the Longenberger Company would sell the home to the alleged great-great-grandson, Jeff Adams. Jeff and his business partner, Felix Spector, would establish the non-profit in 2006, the George W. Adams Educational Center, that still currently operates the estate to this day. As we stated at the beginning of this episode, this prior version of the board would dissolve in 2017, and we had to take over the challenges that it left behind. So there you have it. We have finally came full circle with our story. I can't discuss the ghost of a property without talking about its history, and I can't talk about the history of a property without talking about its ghost. Now that we've discussed the history of Prospect Place, we need to discuss its hauntings. I had to make quite a few corrections in our history segment on the believed history of the mansion. And surprise, surprise, I will also be doing the same for our information on the mansion's hauntings and ghostly legends. Unfortunately, hundreds, possibly thousands of teams have investigated this property over the years, and up to this point, nobody had even questioned the stories they had been told. It's important to remember that researching the property is just as important as conducting the investigation, and this is why. I'm about to tear apart nearly every television show that has ever filmed misinformation at this property. So let's begin. One of the most common claims of activity on the property is that of a little girl that is occasionally seen and heard within the mansion. Her story has been aired on Ghost Hunters, Ghost Adventures, you name it. This legend was introduced and stated by the previous Board of Trustees. The story goes that a young girl was sick and had stumbled off of one of the porticos of the property and fell to her death. Apparently the ground was too cold to dig her grave at the time, and her body was stored in a refrigeration pit in the basement until the ground thawed for a proper burial. First off, our team has received several EVPs from what seems to be a child on the property, so I think there is something to this, but I don't necessarily buy the exact legend and story that's been passed down. I find it strange and ironic that when this story first aired, the previous owner was convinced the young girl was Constance. However, Ghost Hunters did actually call out this misinformation on their show, and informed him that Constance died at the age of 21 of tuberculosis. So to their credit, they were actually able to at least call out one small piece of misinformation that was being shared amongst the community and the public at that time. The story was also repeated on the episode of Ghost Adventures, except this time a name wasn't provided, and the previous owner claimed that she fell out of a specific portico of the home. I find that incredibly strange, and here's why. To date, there's been no solid documentation or evidence to prove that this event actually took place at the mansion. Nothing at all. So how does the prior owner know exactly what portico she fell out of for that episode? In short, he doesn't. This is a retelling of a legend that hasn't aged well over time. While the speculation of a child on the property likely came from EVPs that have been captured, nobody knows who the girl is or why she's been reported on this property. Ghost Adventures could and should have asked how he knew it was that particular portico that this poor girl fell from, and they would have opened up a can of worms of misinformation. Instead, they went with the story for the sake of entertainment. We'll get to Zach and his crew a few times during this segment. To say they dropped the ball in their episode would be a massive understatement. Some of my favorite EVPs that have been captured on the property was with this possible entity. And when you get audio evidence from a little girl with 3 guys on your team, it truly makes you think for a minute, especially when the responses seem to indicate an intelligent haunting. We've captured her laughing on audio, telling us it's cold outside, and also telling us that one of our team members was a good reader after he read a book to her. To me, I consider this story a legend that was likely started by the community. The Adams were a well-known family in the area, and I can't imagine that an incident such as this wouldn't have been published in the local papers. For now, I would have to say that this is merely a legend, unless somebody can provide solid documentation showing that this event actually took place. It's possible that something happened at the mansion during the rental era, but again, there's been no valid documentation presented to back that theory up either. So for now, this remains a mystery. The Bounty Hunter is another popular story from Prospect Place that I throw into the legends category. Supposedly, a bounty hunter came into the area and he'd been scouting Prospect Place's Underground Railroad activity. He was convinced that there were escaped slaves on the property, and he knocked on the front door to confront George Adams about it. Legend has it that George Adams answered the door with his gun, and the workers on the property started to gather to see what the commotion was about. The bounty hunter quickly backed down once he realized he was significantly outnumbered, and he would leave and head back to his campsite. The bounty hunter was likely planning on heading back south to report his findings and come back to the mansion with reinforcements. However, legend indicates that the farmhands at the mansion abducted the bounty hunter and brought him back to the house. They briefly conducted a mock trial and realized that they couldn't let him go. The house and the Underground Railroad operation at the mansion would be compromised if he were to escape. So the legend indicates that the bounty hunter was hung in the barn and buried somewhere on the property. Naturally, he is believed to hang out, no pun intended, in the barn because of this. Now let's be realistic. Nobody really kept records or Underground Railroad documentation in those days, let alone any documentation of illegal murders that might have been tied to their property. So I don't really scrutinize this legend as much. There were also frequent reports of bounty hunters being seen in Zanesville around this time period, so it's not at all that unrealistic to think that this event might have actually happened. The barn is a hot spot for the ghost hunting shows, and naturally they found ways to muck that up as well. Ghost hunters documented a possible thermal hit in the barn on their episode. My guess is it was an animal, but whatever. And Zach claimed that he had rocks thrown at him in the Ghost Adventures episode. Oddly enough, the biggest offenders for the bounty hunter would ironically be Ghost Brothers, who not only got themselves banned from the property for going up to the blocked-off, unsafe floors of the barn, but they also made their show a circus by bringing in cadaver dogs to try to find the body of the bounty hunter. They claimed that they had a few hits in the second stall of the barn. Well, what did they find? Massive groundhog holes that aren't uncommon in the barn area. However, with the magic of video editing, the viewer wouldn't need to know that information. It's all for entertainment after all, right? Let's put it this way. If you wanted to get rid of a body, why would you bury it in a barn? Especially if the owner of the property has thousands of acres in which it could have been disposed of. George W. Adams owned all of Trinway and large chunks of Dresden around that time. If they wanted to make a body disappear, they wouldn't have buried it in a barn, and they would have had several options and acres of which to dispose of the remains. I have received a disembodied voice in the barn after conducting several investigations in there. It's honestly usually pretty quiet for me. I'm not sure I personally buy the legend of the bounty hunter itself, but at the same time I'm not ruling it out either. I also know some other individuals that I have considered as reliable investigators that have also had some strange occurrences in there. Another popular ghost hunting spot in the mansion is the ballroom. If you watched the Ghost Adventures episode, you were advised that the room was used for satanic rituals and that a portal was opened up in a room during the mansion's abandoned era. Ironically, the origin of this legend changed between the episodes of Ghost Hunters and Ghost Adventures, as well as the dates that it supposedly happened. The prior owners found graffiti, dead animals, and other odd symbols when they started the restoration process. So naturally, this could only mean one thing. Demons and satanic rituals. Right? I used to call this room the pigeon portal to hell when I conducted my tours, and this is due to the massive amount of pigeons that used to live in the soffits of the house. It literally sounded like you were surrounded by nothing but bird coos when you were up there, before we had the soffits repaired a few years back. The house took a lot of damage during the abandoned era, and it's not unthinkable that animals likely got into the house and died. After all, animals still try to get into the house to this day. The birds used to make scratching noises in the walls, and naturally every ghost hunting group on TV seemed to have its battles with it. Ghost hunters had a single bat, and they were screaming about it till no end. Ghost Brothers were freaking out about the scratching sounds, despite being warned about it earlier in their episode. Slick editing, boys. And then there was Zach, who tripped over a bench and thought he was getting laughed at on their episode. I challenge you to play that scene back and listen very closely to the EVP that they thought they captured of laughing. Yep. It was a disembodied pigeon coo. Zach and company labeled it as laughter. My tour groups used to get a kick out of that one. The graffiti was just that, a bunch of punk kids that ran through the house scribbling vampire references and Led Zeppelin songs. Some people have claimed to have been scratched up in the ballroom, but I have personally never had that experience myself. I honestly blame the Ghost Adventures episode for the dark vibe and negative feelings that people get up there. It was a rather unique visual when we decked out the ballroom for our masquerade ball a few times, and it was pretty funny getting to see it in a more upbeat light during our parties. That being said, I have heard footsteps and EVPs in the area, so I'm not saying it's completely silent, but certainly be aware of your surroundings when you investigate up there. There have also been reports of groups capturing the sounds of what is believed to be phantom music that appears to be coming from the ballroom as well. Our team has also captured this on one occasion. Most of my paranormal experiences in Prospect Place over the years have came from the second floor, and it's not uncommon to get intelligent female EVP responses in this area. This is also where most of the reports of footsteps in the mansion come from, oddly enough. At the beginning of this episode, I discussed our first investigation of the property, and also the footsteps that our team experienced. This would also occasionally happen during the time I was one of the owners. My stepson Isaiah was with me one day when we opened up the property up for tours. We checked all the floors to make sure the paranormal group from the night before had cleaned up, and then we went outside to the road and put out the open flag. We both walked back in and were standing on the first floor main hallway when the footsteps started walking above us. Isaiah was legitimately creeped out, and I was trying not to laugh. Like it always seems to do, the footsteps lasted for about 2 minutes, and then they stopped. He looked at me horrified and said, "Nobody's up there." I simply responded with, "I know." I then asked him if he wanted to go see what it was, and we went up to investigate. Naturally, nothing appeared to be out of place. Other groups have also claimed to have seen a female apparition on the floor from time to time, and it's not uncommon for groups to also report female audio responses. I've speculated in the past that the entities might be Anna and Constance. However, getting them to confirm this has sometimes been a challenge. My best audio response with a name is when I asked who are the females currently on the property. "Is Anna Adams here?" Shortly after, a female voice appeared on my audio and stated, "Anna's back now." So perhaps I am right about one of them. On another investigation, I put a recorder on the second floor while our team was setting up. We were running cable to the basement, and you could hear us talking in the background. Suddenly, an EVP appeared on the audio asking, "What are they doing?" while another seemed to respond, "I don't know." That was interesting to say the least. I've only had one gripe about a paranormal show that's recorded at the mansion and talked about Anna, and it's a rather large gripe. Haunted Case Files. It was a ridiculous show that followed amateur ghost hunters around to tell stories, and then recreate their experiences on a soundstage. I kid you not, the filming wasn't even on location. I was on vacation for my anniversary when Prospect Place suddenly appeared on the television screen. I told my wife, "Well, this is interesting. I don't remember the show ever filming at the mansion." They were talking about the mansion's construction workers being scared away from the property in 2003, and poof, the next thing you know, my photo pops up on the screen. Naturally, I was irritated as I didn't give them permission to use my photo or my likeness. So there you go, folks, my 5 seconds of unwanted paranormal television fame. I later joked with Jeff that we needed to update our convention banners with the tagline, "As seen on Haunted Case Files." So anyway, this father and daughter team has an experience where one of them is pushed, and the girl looks dead into the camera and says that Anna was aggressive, and that's just how she is. My jaw hit the floor. Literally the one time one of these shows cover Anna, and they messed it up like this. There have never been any malevolent reports that I'm aware of with Anna over the years. At this point, I just turned the show off. It was a complete joke, to put it mildly. While I have received and heard other groups occasionally getting male EVPs at the mansion, usually the most common audio responses in the house appear to be female. Some teams have speculated that the spirits of William Cox and George Adams occasionally make an appearance, but the females of the house still seem to be the most active. The last reported haunting from the mansion that we're going to discuss today is the train wreck that occurred on December 3rd, 1912. Unfortunately, a passenger train had broken down on the tracks, and another train, unaware of the situation, slammed into the back of it, instantly killing 8 people and injuring several others at the point of impact. The event itself could have been avoided if the oncoming train could have been flagged down and stopped in time, but the trains were traveling so close together after they left the station that it was impossible. It was later reported that the trains were only running about 3 minutes apart from one another. Ghost Adventures focused in on the wreck for their history segments of the show, and the mansion's previous owner stated that the trains had been traveling to Mount Vernon at the time of the wreck, and that they aired a claim that the basement had been turned into a field hospital for the train wreck victims. Yep. I think you guys know where I'm going with this. My research disproved a few things about this story. Well, the train wreck did certainly happen. However, they weren't heading to Mount Vernon at the time. They were heading to Zanesville. The wreck actually occurred in between Dresden and Zanesville near Rock Cut Road on a railroad line that no longer exists, nearly 6 miles away from the mansion. And the claim about the victims being brought to the house? Well, that's also a bunch of nonsense. There was a first-hand witness account of the wreck published by the Times-Recorder on December 4th, 1912. It clearly states that the crash site itself was turned into a field hospital until another train could come in and load up the passengers and take them to Zanesville for assistance. The article went into grisly details about the dying at the scene, when the physicians arrived, and also how the crash site itself was turned into a field hospital. From the Times-Recorder eyewitness account. Many killed in rear-end collision of passenger trains at Dresden. 8 dead, 4 dying, others injured, all frightfully mangled and scalded. Passengers from the safe cars responded to the calls of the suffering, and work of rescuing the dead and injured began at once. They were carried from the ill-fated car and placed on improvised cots made from cushions of the cars. The rescuers faced a situation that paled the most strong-hearted. The cries of strong men mingled with those of women and pitying appeals of children. The odors of burning flesh filled the car and added another torture to the work. The rescuers found men and women slowly cooking to death in steam or over the heater boiler of the engine. After the work of the rescue was underway, bonfires were built around the wreck to illuminate the scene and provide warmth for those that had escaped. The dead bodies and injured were placed beside the fires while the physicians applied emergency remedies. In an effort to provide shelter for the injured, several were carried into the baggage car where they were made as comfortable as possible. The Dresden physicians, the first on the scene, were busy applying bandages to the injured and rendering first aid. When the rescue train arrived on the scene, many of the injured had already been cared for. The dead, injured, and the rest of the passengers were taken to Zanesville nearly 2 hours after the wreck. It would in turn take the injured and deceased to the depot in Zanesville. From there, the critically injured were admitted into Good Samaritan and Bethesda hospitals. Undertaking firms started the process of notifying the families of the deceased. There was no mention of this myth about the mansion being used as a field hospital that was aired on television by supposed expert paranormal investigators. You can still see paranormal teams trying to cite the story in their blogs and videos, despite it being disproven through my research. To make matters worse, the Ghost Adventures crew, looking for a photo of the train wreck to use on their show, apparently used the Holocaust photo for the crash site reference for the sake of shock value. Yeah. Investigators. Once again, this should show you that the television shows only care about one thing: entertainment. They don't care about the facts behind the ghost stories and legends. They also don't research what they're airing on television. I'm not gonna lie, the coverage of this event still makes me angry, especially after reading the reports of the eyewitness accounts of the victims that suffered during this tragic event. Women, children, to put it bluntly, the victims have been exploited for the sake of ghostly legends and stories, and to have the story aired the way that it was on television is disgraceful. Our board of trustees immediately discussed this event on social media once my research was completed. We wanted to let the public know the true story of what happened on that night. And now, hopefully the truth will spread in the years to come. That being said, we're going to take a short break and continue our story of Prospect Place Mansion after the break. Hey, you. Have you ever thought about starting your own podcast? I can tell you firsthand that starting a podcast has been a fun and rewarding experience. However, the process can feel overwhelming if you don't know how to get started. That is where Buzzsprout comes in. In fact, it's so good that they've already helped over 100,000 people start their own podcast. Buzzsprout will help you get your podcast onto every major podcasting platform, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. You also get a professional website and audio players to share on other websites, detailed analytics, and other tools to help you promote your episodes. Buzzsprout also publishes tutorials, blog posts, and YouTube videos every week to help you get started. To launch your own podcast and to collect your $20 Amazon gift card for signing up, click the link in our show notes on this media player's information panel. This will help support our show, and it will also help Buzzsprout know that we sent you. Buzzsprout, the easiest way to start a podcast. This episode was also brought to you by our good friend Spencer Shepard at B&B Concrete in Shelby, Ohio. He has some amazing stone pieces for your lawn and garden, such as Sasquatches, gargoyles, bird bass, and even dragons. Be the coolest person on your block and visit facebook.com/bnbconcreteman or email bnbconcreteman@gmail.com for more information. Do you like hot sauce? Perhaps it's time to dance with the Reaper. Visit our friends at Spice for Lives Foods on Facebook today. They've recently launched their first hot sauce line called Dance with the Reaper, and they will be debuting their signature taco sauce and Caribbean Rio habanero sauce in the near future. I also hear they're in the process of working on something rather ghostly. Once again, that is Spice for Lives Foods on Facebook. Stop in and visit them today. Alright, welcome back. It's time to answer a few questions from our listeners. As always, you can submit your questions for the show on social media, or contact form on cbusparanormal.com, or email us directly at cbusparanormal@hotmail.com. The first question for today comes from Mallory in Mansfield, Ohio. Her email states, "Hello, I've really enjoyed listening to your podcast and I appreciate the details that you've provided for the locations that you have covered. I have to ask, do you know how many people actually died in the mansion?" Well, first off, thank you for the compliment. As far as deaths, it's honestly anybody's guess. However, I am going to let you guys in on a secret. There are possibly 3 deaths related to the household that have never been aired on television or really discussed publicly in the paranormal sense. I'm not going to provide the names at this time, but board member Amy Green has been doing a stellar job of researching the family's history. She'll come out with what she discovers when the time is right. In the meantime, I'm going to try to help out by pulling death records and other information that might be useful. I know that at the minimum, George W. Adams and Constance Cox died in the home. However, if the 3 previously mentioned individuals died in the home, that would push the total to 5. And it might help explain some of our audio that our team has recorded in the past. So stay tuned. Our second question comes from Christina in Zanesville, Ohio. It states, "Thank you for telling the mansion's real history. I visited the mansion for the first time in 2006, and it's been amazing to see the building's progress since the new board has taken over. What would you consider your greatest accomplishments as one of the owners of the property? And looking back on your time there, if you had the chance, would you have did anything differently?" As far as our greatest accomplishments, I think demystifying the property certainly helped. I remember hearing the reactions of the townsfolk when we first started investigating the building. Some of the locals were literally scared of the property. Hell, we had pizza guys that wouldn't even come past the front gate. We were able to give the property back to the community in a way. We restored its history, ran community events, and really just tried to make it a fun location to visit. Now they have Civil War reenactments, 1860s baseball games, masquerade balls, and it's no longer just a spook house. I think the local community appreciates that. It was also an honor to finally help kick the pigeons out of the soffits. That was a long time coming. Looking back, if I could have did anything different, I would have loved to have seen more interior restoration completed. However, we had the tremendous tax burden left by the previous administration that cost us nearly $6,000 a year. I would have loved to have been able to reinvest that money into restoration work, but unfortunately it wasn't meant to be or possible considering the situation at the time. Otherwise, I really don't have any regrets from my time on the board. Our next question came in on our cbusparanormal.com contact form, and a name didn't appear to be submitted with this question. The question itself asks, Do you know the exact location of the 1912 train wreck? Thanks. Unfortunately, I do not. I know the wreck occurred on a railroad line that no longer exists, and it occurred on the curve of Rock Cut Road about 6 miles away from the mansion. The old line went in the opposite direction of the tracks that are currently there. So while I have a guess where the trek possibly occurred, I unfortunately don't have the exact coordinates. I did see a paranormal team on YouTube that claimed to have investigated the crash site in the past, but I can tell you by their video they were definitely in the wrong location. Our final question comes from Rob in Wheeling, West Virginia. It states, I just finished listening to episode 5, and wow, I'm very interested in learning more about Blackburn. While he was obviously a criminal, he seems to have lived a life of pure chaos. Do you think that his sewer escape influenced the story for Shawshank Redemption? And do you know of any other buildings that he helped build? Well, Blackburn, he was an interesting fella. He certainly lived an interesting life. I don't believe his escape influenced the writing of Shawshank Redemption at all, even though the plan of escape was very similar. Blackburn's escape from the Ohio Penitentiary was often cited as one of the greatest prison escapes of the 1800s, and rightfully so. While Blackburn was most certainly a ruthless criminal, I would also like to know more about his personality and what made him actually tick. He was obviously smart in planning his calculated escapes, but at the same time I don't understand why he couldn't turn his life around and live an honest life. I do have an interview from the 1880s where Blackburn mentions working on the insane asylum formerly in Columbus, Ohio, and also the Zanesville courthouse. So I'm guessing he found work in between his escapes and early releases. Oddly enough, there is also an old legend that I discovered where it's been said Blackburn buried a significant amount of money in between his prison sentences, and when he went back to reclaim it, he couldn't find it. I do believe that I have pinpointed that property where this event possibly happened, so you never know. I might be sharing some more Blackburn news with all of you in the near future. In conclusion, I'm still extremely proud of my former board members and colleagues that still continue to fight to preserve the mansion to this day. It's been a long battle. At the beginning of episode 5, I briefly talked about the property tax issue that we inherited, and I'm glad to say that it has been resolved. The board has also paid off other debts the previous administration had accumulated over the years, and the mansion is now finally getting a fresh start. We also removed several tons of clutter, literally, and have the mansion looking better than it has in quite some time. The board's involvement with the community continues to grow, and I appreciate everyone that's continued to support their efforts to this day. I did recently step down from my board member position at the end of 2021 after several years. At that time, I decided it was time to focus on my family and do what was necessary to help us phase into our next challenges in life. Between raising children, the long drive, and other battles along the way, the grind finally got to me. I still plan to volunteer down at the mansion from time to time when I'm able to, and I'll always be here if they need me down in Trinway. This concludes our location spotlight episode on historic Prospect Place Mansion. I hope you all appreciated hearing me ramble on about all the inaccuracies that have been aired about this location in the past. While the television shows haven't did the mansion justice over the years, know that the location is still an important and historic structure from a long-forgotten era, and perhaps there are still a few ghostly happenings within the mansion's walls. Prospect Place is still one of my favorite locations to investigate, and the current board of trustees continue to make progress on preserving the mansion for future generations. To get information on their tours and investigations of Prospect Place Mansion, visit their official website at gwacenter.org. Again, that's gwacenter.org. Next month, we're going to be doing something a little different. We will be airing a paranormal review episode. Basically, I'm going to be forced to watch some of the worst paranormal television shows out there, and then comment on the episode as we watch it in real time. I asked some of my friends on Facebook what episode we should review on the Paracast. Naturally, the Ghost Adventures episode of Prospect Place Mansion seemed to dominate the discussion and request. So next month, I'll be tearing it apart in real time, and we can watch the show together. That being said, I'm giving you all some homework in the meantime. Find Ghost Adventures through your favorite streaming platform, whether it be Discovery Plus, which I'll be using, Amazon, Apple, YouTube, or by some legal or illegal means. If you want to watch the episode along with me, find Season 3, Episode 7. The episode should be 43 minutes long. I'll be giving a countdown on the next episode, and I'll tell you when to hit the play button so it'll sync up with my audio from the Paracast. For those of you that don't want to watch along, I will be giving descriptions of what is actually happening on the episode, so you should have a decent idea of what's transpiring. Once again, please remember to visit us on cbusparanormal.com and our social media pages for the latest updates. We have also started adding bonus Paracast content to our TikTok and YouTube pages, so make sure to subscribe to hear EVPs, see special footage, and other additional content related to future episodes. Once again, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next month. Would you like to meet our team in person? Join us on August 13th, 2022, from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. at the West Virginia Penitentiary Paracon. This event is going to be held at the West Virginia Penitentiary in Moundsville, West Virginia, which is an awesome location. There will also be some special events afterwards that are still to be announced. Please visit wvpentours.com for more information.